Hello, brothers and sisters. I'm Father Frank Pavone, National Director of Priests for Life. Welcome to another episode of our Election Videos series, helping our fellow citizens and fellow believers to prepare for this year's elections. Well, I want to talk to you today about how your vote influences the Supreme Court. Many voters are motivated by the fact that the way they vote in the presidential race and also for their United States senators impacts the direction that the Supreme Court is going to take. And not only the Supreme Court, but the other federal courts as well. I want to just give you a little bit of background. We'll talk about more of this in other videos as well, because it's such a crucial topic that motivates so many voters. But let me begin by talking a little bit about the role of the court, the role of the president, the role of the United States Senate. The Supreme Court obviously is a very powerful institution in our nation. Its existence, of course, is founded in the Constitution, and the court is the last court of appeal for judicial controversies, matters that originate in the federal courts at what is called the district level. There are various districts in each state. Can, if they are appealed, then go to what are called the courts of appeals or the circuit courts. And there are some 13 circuits. These are geographical areas that involve several states. And you've got this court that presides over the judicial disputes of those several states across the nation. Those are the appeals courts, or again, the circuit courts. And then if something is litigated in the circuit courts and people want to appeal the decision from those courts, they can appeal to the Supreme Court. But very few of those appeals, 1 or 2% of those cases that go knocking at the door of the Supreme Court, are actually accepted by the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court might not want to accept a case for various legal, judicial reasons, which sometimes they explain and often they don't. But also, it's just a matter of practicality. There are 9 justices on the Supreme Court. There are only 365 days of the year, and there's only so much bandwidth they have in order to process cases, to hear the arguments, to read the briefs, to write the decisions. There's only so much time they have. So the Supreme Court only decides a very small portion of the federal cases. The rest of them are decided on either the appellate level, the circuit courts, or the district courts, which are below those and much more numerous. These are our federal courts. And whether we are talking about the district courts, the circuit courts, or the Supreme Court, the judges that serve on those courts for lifetime terms are chosen by the President of the United States. See, this is where you come in. While there are various local judges that do run for elections, and you can vote for them directly, these judges on the federal courts, you don't vote for directly. You vote for them indirectly. You vote for them, that is, in the sense of what kind of judges they are, what direction they may go philosophically and ideologically. You get to have a say in that by what kind of president you elect. So the president is responsible, again, this is grounded in the Constitution. He is responsible for choosing, nominating a man or a woman who is judicially qualified to serve on these courts, to serve when there is a particular vacancy. Again, either on the district, circuit, or Supreme Courts. Then, once the president makes his selection, that man or woman has to be approved, confirmed is the technical term, by the United States Senate. Now, senators in the United States Senate, there are 100 of them, 2 for each of the 50 states. They run for re-election, if they want to get re-elected, every 6 years. Each one of them has a 6-year term. And the way that these elections are set up is that 1/3 of the senators, so in other words, 33 or 34 as the case may be, senators will be up for election on any given election year. So every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate is on the ballot for re-election. Either they'll run for re-election or they'll say, I'm retiring, and then it's an open race where 2 people are competing for that seat. Now, each election year, every 2 years, you have to see, and this year, 2020, you need to see whether you are going to be able to elect one of the 2 of your United States senators. And sometimes the way things work out, both senators might be on the ballot, which actually is the case this year for the state of Georgia. The ones you elect for the United States Senate are also shaping the courts. So this is where and how the federal courts get shaped. And depending upon whether the President and the United States Senate are Republican, as they are now, both the White House and the Senate majority are Republican, or whether they are both in Democrat hands, or whether it's split, the White House of one party, the Senate of another, that very much affects the process of confirming these judges. And the process of confirming these judges has become more and more contentious over recent years. And that's because the courts have become more and more politicized. They're not supposed to be political branches. When you elect your member of Congress, your state legislator, your governor, or your president, that is a political race. They take positions on issues. They let people know what they're going to fight for, whether they're going to stand, for example, for the protection of babies in the womb, or whether they're not. And they, on any range of issues, they're going to make their positions known, and they're going to ask for your vote as a result of you agreeing with them on that issue. These judges, it's not supposed to be that way, because the courts are not entitled to make or change laws. That power on the federal level is given only to the Congress. The courts are there to resolve disputes between 2 parties that come to the court and say, we have a dispute about how this law applies to us, or whether it's even constitutional. And so the court has to look at the law as it's written, has to look at the Constitution as it's written, and based on those things has to resolve the dispute. And their decision might be, yes, the law is unconstitutional, and really the legislature should change it, but they have to say to the legislature that they should change it. They can't change it themselves. And they can't write new laws, and they can't invent new rights. But unfortunately, the courts have become very political, and they have been doing exactly that. They've been inventing rights that nowhere exist in the Constitution. That's what they did with the so-called right to abortion in the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973. But here I just want to focus on the fact that your vote matters in the direction that the courts are going to take. And right now, the Supreme Court is very, very divided. President Trump has been able to appoint 2 justices to the Supreme Court, Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh. But just prior to that, when Justice Kavanaugh replaced Justice Kennedy, we had a situation where, and it still often happens, some of the most consequential decisions of the court were decided on a 5-4 basis. Because you have 4 members of the court who are very, very reliably voting in the direction that would be more to the left, and another 4 who are very reliably voting in the direction of to the right. And Justice Kennedy was for a very long time considered and was in fact the swing vote on a lot of these closely divided decisions. And more Chief Justice Roberts has been playing that role in the current court. The point being that the kind of president that we elect and the kind of U.S. Senate that we elect is going to be determinative of whether the courts, not only the Supreme Court, but all these other federal courts, move more to the left or to the right. And now I have here, interestingly, some of the votes of Supreme Court confirmations over the recent few decades. And I want you to notice how it has changed, because this is significant about our voting as well. Justice Antonin Scalia, who passed away in 2016, just before the elections of that year, when he was nominated by President Reagan, his confirmation had no opposition to it. None. 0 of the senators voted against him. His vote, he was confirmed by a vote of 98-0. That was in 1986. Sometimes individual senators are not able to vote. They may be because of sickness or something else that takes them away from the vote. Justice Kennedy, whom I just referred to, when he was confirmed in 1988, nobody voted against him either. He was confirmed by the Senate on a vote of 97-0. David Souter, nominated by George Bush Sr., was confirmed by a vote of 90-9. So these are very lopsided votes. Now, Clarence Thomas, who was confirmed in 1991, then the vote got much, much closer, because you remember there was a controversy with him over the accusations of Anita Hill and so forth. So his vote now changed dramatically. It was only 52-48, a very slim majority of the Senate confirming him. But then Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, the Republicans in the Senate and the people generally knew, as she was going through her confirmation process, they knew how left-leaning she was and is. It was known. It was no secret. And nevertheless, the Republican senators were able to vote not on the question of how is she likely to decide certain cases, but rather on the question of her qualifications to serve as a justice of the Supreme Court. That's what the senators are supposed to focus on. And in fact, that's what they did focus on, because Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was nominated by Bill Clinton, was confirmed by a vote of 96-3. 96-3. And that was in 1993. Stephen Breyer, again nominated by Clinton, confirmed by a vote of 87-9. Now, once we got into the George W. Bush presidency, and he was nominating John Roberts and Samuel Alito, the votes began to get much more divided along party lines in the U.S. Senate. Now, you had Roberts, well, still it was a pretty lopsided vote, 78-22. But you notice, now those were more opposing votes than at any time since Clarence Thomas. And then Samuel Alito got almost as many no votes as Clarence Thomas had gotten. He was confirmed by only 58-42 margin. So you notice it's getting tighter, more evenly divided. Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan were confirmed. Those were the two President Obama nominations. They got confirmed by comfortable margins, 68-31, 63-37. But Neil Gorsuch, President Trump's first nominee, 54-45. And Justice Brett Kavanaugh, even narrower than that. In October of 2018, he was confirmed by a vote of 50-48. Now, brothers and sisters, what I'm saying to you is this. The Republicans in the Senate at the time of the Justice Kavanaugh confirmation only had a majority of 51. And there are two senators, Murkowski and Collins, who often vote, for example, on abortion-related matters. They often vote on the pro-abortion side. And it wasn't, people weren't sure if they would support the president's nominee, and it was clear that abortion was the driving factor behind all this fuss. They very much needed those votes, and Susan Collins, of course, ended up voting for Justice Kavanaugh, which secured his confirmation. But when you have just such a close margin, and when you have some senators that you're not sure are going to agree with all of your nominees, even if they're of the same party, that means that there's a temptation to choose a less controversial judge. There's a temptation to choose maybe a less strong judge on matters like abortion. What I'm saying is this. Your vote for United States senators, as well as, of course, for the president, is going to determine pretty directly what kind of judges we get and how strong they're going to be. If the Democrats are in control of the Senate, you will not get pro-life judges, either on the Supreme Court or on any of the other courts. This is just the fact of the matter. If you have a Republican majority in the Senate, you'll get better judges. But the more of a majority you have, the better judges you'll get. And here's the reason. There's wiggle room. Let's say if they appoint a judge who's, he'll probably be pretty good on abortion, as opposed to one who has a very strong record and there's no question whatsoever. Some of the senators, even if they're Republican, like Murkowski and Collins, may get a little bit squeamish and not be willing to cast their vote. You want the strongest kind of judges nominated and confirmed? Well, then what you want is a bigger majority of Republicans in the United States Senate. This is simply the way that it works at this point in our nation's history. And I wanted to bring that up because many of you and many voters across our country are already very, very motivated by understanding that their vote affects the federal courts. Let's bring this into careful consideration as we examine the candidates, hear what they have to say about their judges, and we make our decisions. President Trump did something unprecedented, and it was very wise. He published a list during his campaign of who he would choose from were he able to fill a vacancy on the Supreme Court. And he kept to that promise. We should ask all the candidates to do that. So let's continue to speak about and pray about the courts and the role that our vote has in shaping them. We'll talk more about this in future videos. And if you want to see the other videos that we're making in this series, go to electionvideos.org. Our overall election website is prolifevote.com. Well, thanks, friends. I'm Father Frank Pavone of Priests for Life. God bless you.